the things that I've wondered about as the second panel comes up is how we provide a counterweight to the very, very strong influence of hard measures and hard short-term targets. A lot of the things that we're talking about are often deemed soft in board meetings and in conferences and in global discussions. And in a way, what we need to champion is some way of being able to work on the unmeasurable areas that we're talking about, the human dimension, the part of the human dimension that will probably never be measured by AI. So I've got a new panel. They've obediently sit down, and I'm going to take them in the order that they are sitting and start with Henry, if you'd like to just tell us a little bit about how and if we should be starting this movement from the podium here. Last chance to influence the most influential audience in management.
Which movement?
Uh-huh.
Because the question is not how we start the movement or what we do on Monday, but what the heck we're trying to start a movement for. And I think we differ. The problem is not that business will change the world. The problem is that business has been changing the world. That's our problem. To repeat what I said yesterday, which was for today, capitalism needs fixing, but fixing capitalism will no more fix society than fixing communism would have fixed the societies of Eastern Europe. Because they face the same problem. The Eastern European countries were utterly out of balance on the side of their public sectors, and many of the Western and other countries are out of balance on the side of their private sectors. So capitalism will not solve the problem that it has largely created. Capitalism needs to be put in its place, which is the marketplace, and out of the public place. Leave the public place to governments and to communities, which have been depreciated enormously in the last few decades. A healthy society, like a stable stool that you sit on, has to balance itself on three solid legs. A public sector that attends to our collective needs, a private sector that supplies our personal needs, and a plural sector that fulfills our social needs in communities. It's this third sector that's the key to changing things, because we don't recognize the third sector, so we swing back and forth between the public and the private, between left and right, between government controls and market forces. And we need a third sector for balance, and I call that the plural sector because civil society doesn't sound like it goes with public-private. Plural goes with public-private, and that's a game changer. That's not a casual suggestion. The idea that a third sector is key to rebalancing and key to driving the rebalancing is important. Not that it's the more important sector, but for the change process on Monday morning, it's the plural sector that has to do the acting. The plural sector is huge, and yet it's obscure. But it wasn't obscure. De Tocqueville talked about that 200 years ago as the key to American democracy. That idea has been lost. But let me quote somebody named Peter Drucker, who some of you may have heard of, who wrote in 2003. This is quite a startling comment, thanks to Timo out there, who found this or mentioned this to me. Management was neither my first, nor has it been my foremost concern. I only became interested in it because of my work on community and society. That, by the way, was Peter Drucker talking in this room. Now, let me give you an example of the plural sector starting things and starting a movement. That's exactly what's going on here. We're here in a plural sector organization called the Drucker Society, and we're sitting here describing how we can promote change. Even people in business or in government or in universities or whatever else are sitting here as individuals and as citizens of their societies and of the world, and listening to what a plural sector society has to say about driving change. It's happening right here, the very thing I'm talking about. Okay, how to proceed? I don't know about Monday morning, but I would suggest we proceed on January 5th, because I'm having a little meeting with a few very smart people on January 4th and 5th, and maybe we'll come up with what we should do on Monday morning, which is January 7th. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Henry. That's intriguing. Rita.
Great. Is this on?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Little known fact about me, when I was in my doctoral program, one of my professors assigned me to read the entire works of Peter Drucker in one semester. It was a life-changing event, as I'm sure you can remember. So I'd like to be really pragmatic about this. You're not going to change your whole lives because of anything any of us say right now, but you could change how you use an hour a week. And so my recommendation to you is think a little bit about what you could spend 1 hour more on that would lead you personally in whatever areas of influence you have to have an impact, and maybe what you want to spend 1 hour less on. I don't think there are any of us that couldn't spend 1 hour less on something kind of meaningless to really focus on 1 hour more. A couple of practical ideas to go with that, and this is some work that was done by the folks that work on growth mindsets, that you can actually trick your brain. And if you use if-then statements, your brain goes to work without your even knowing it. So if you say, if at 5 o'clock, I'm going to reach out to somebody in Henry's network to have a discussion about how we might further that conversation. And your brain kind of goes, oh wow, it's 3 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock, it's 5 o'clock, there's something I'm supposed to be doing. So try to formulate whatever it is you're going to use your hour more for in terms of if-then statements. So if it's Thursday afternoon at 4, I'm going to do action X. Next thing that I would suggest is when you think about your own personal goals and what success looks like, I work with a lot of executives and they tell me things like, oh, my goal is to be an E4. And you say to them, well, what is it you want to accomplish by being an E4? Assuming that's some very lofty level in some mega corporation. And they'll say, well, but E4s have great offices and they have parking spaces and and I'm like, really? That's like nirvana for you? And when you really probe, what it turns out is what they want is the ability to have impact, to have action, to have respect from people, blah, blah, blah. So my second piece of advice for you is with that hour, think a little bit about what it is that success would look like for you, and then give yourself the task of thinking through what are the different ways I could get there. So maybe one of those ways is to indeed become an E4, but there may be many others. And so give yourself the time and space to do some of that. Last thing, and I'll try to be brief, is we've learned so much about the power of diversity, about getting out of your own bubble and hearing what other people have to say. So use a few of those 1 hours that you've freed up for yourself by doing something very deliberate about that. Have lunch or a coffee or something with somebody who you normally wouldn't talk to. Try to widen the aspect ratio, if you will, of your view of the world. And I think you'll be surprised at some of the things you might learn.
What would you use your hour for, Rita?
My hour for?
Yeah.
This coming Monday? It probably will be synthesizing what I've learned from this conference to be really boring and academic about you. But no, I would be trying to think about if I had only that hour to spend, where would I have the greatest leverage? Right.
Roger Martin.
So when I think about movements, the person who is most helpful that I found is a guy named Charles Tilley. And for Canadians here, it's not the guy who makes comfortable safari hats. It was a sociologist who wrote an article about 25 years ago about the movement equation. He said, movement will be successful if you multiply 4 things together and it's as big a number as possible. Numbers times commitment times unity times worthiness. And I think it's a good one. So you could say Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they actually had good numbers. There was a hiddenly large number of folks willing to support it. The commitment of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and lots of others who were willing to go to jail and the like. Unity, they actually were interested in getting only a few things. They didn't let it be diffuse. We're going to march on Washington to get these few things and ultimate worthiness. So I don't think we've got the numbers, commitment, unity, worthiness thing going enough yet, and I would think of working on that. Worthiness, we talk about long-termism, but we talk as much about it as helping to make shareholders more money. Well, that doesn't feel as worthy as the worthiness that comes from having greater prosperity and productivity that's shared by more people. That would make it more worthy. partially, I think, because there's a lot of factions, we don't have unity on what exactly we're looking for, and I don't think there's enough commitment. People talk about it, but aren't willing to commit to it. So what I'd be thinking about and continue to think about is how can you get numbers, commitment, unity, worthiness all in alignment for this movement.
Thanks very much, Roger. Steve, I know you've been thinking about movements and writing about them.
Let me answer the question by telling the story of my involvement in the Drucker Forum, which I first visited in 2013. And I came here full of hope and had written a book, and I started talking to people about an amazing new way of running organizations. And they said, "What's this about?" And I said, "Well, it's based on Peter Drucker's dictum that the only one valid purpose of a corporation to create a custom, only one." And he said this in 1954, and again in 1973, and again in 1985, so he must have meant it. And I thought, well, this is the Drucker Forum, and I'm talking about Peter Drucker, so I should be okay. But I got a very different reaction. The reaction was, there's really nothing new here. People have talked about these things for ages, and they basically don't work. Big corporations run top-down, management, command and control, and in any event, the purpose of a corporation is to make money, maximize shareholder value. So first, the worst thing about these ideas are where they come from. They come from the software developers, the worst people in the corporation, and we're certainly not going to learn anything from them. So the ideas that I'm talking about didn't really get on the agenda of the Drucker Forum for several years. But I told people at the time, well, just wait, we'll see what happens. So where are we now in 2018? When we look around, we see that the 5 largest and fastest growing firms on the planet happen to be implementing these principles. We see that 90% of senior executives want to implement these principles, although less than 10% are already doing it. And we also see that these ways of doing are highly energizing for the people doing the work, and even better for the businesses, they make tons of money. So when you look around organizations today, any medium, large organization has a kind of sleeper cell of people implementing these ideas. And so my suggestion for those running organizations is that really need to find out what this is about, because those organizations which are implementing these ideas are in fact putting the old organizations out of business. So my message to them is change or die, change or die. But for the rest of us who are not running organizations, my suggestion is you find in the place where you are, in the organization where you are, in the community where you are, the sleeper cell nearest you, where people are already implementing these ideas, we're already being excited about it, who are already getting results from it. Join the movement, because launching the movement, I think, in this area is not the point. The point is to join the movement that's already deeply and broadly underway all around the world. So it's not something that has to be started. It's something where you have to catch a train that's already left the station, a plane that's already taken off. So get on one of those planes, get on one of those trains. This movement is already underway, and the basic idea, and you look at it, is that it's human beings creating more value for other human beings. Human beings creating more value for other human beings. It's valid both in the private sector and the public sector. I was heartened by the fact that we heard this morning that it's being implemented in the German political sphere, and that even Angela Merkel has given a lecture to the German parliament about it. So this idea is quite wide and quite deep, and find out about it, join the movement.
Thanks very much, Steve. Meg Seitz, you're going to be living with the consequences of whatever emerges from this and other gatherings for longer than most of us who are up on stage here. What is the point, the way that you would start to make this, give this movement momentum, or give a movement momentum?
I think The word movement is such a funny word because it means, we initially think it means this big, grand gesture. And really what I find in my experience is that movements are really, they start so small. And they start with really a gut feeling. I am an English major who went to business school, and I had this really small gut feeling that was a business opportunity. And it was nothing that I was grand or over the top talking about or explaining, but it was just a little gut movement that I felt within myself that I needed to do something about. 4 years ago, I started that company, and really what I've come to understand after this week is that what I did then and what my responsibility is now and moving forward as part of, starting and continuing movements is that movements happen when we take responsibility for that gut feeling and we decide to do something about it and we take that personal responsibility. I don't think I've been so aware of what personal responsibility means as I do now after the last several days. And I think about it too because the young leaders that I have talked to here this week, and I explained my business story, the number one question that I get asked is, well, isn't that scary? Weren't you scared? And my answer is always yes, and I did it anyways. And that's a really hard thing to do. I'm not gonna lie and say that that's not hard, but I think movements start when we listen to that gut feeling and we decide to do something about it. Famous quote that we use a lot, Teddy Roosevelt said in 1910 that the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena. And so I feel like when we listen to that gut feeling and we put ourselves in an arena to play on a certain field, we are part of a movement and we are taking responsibility and really personal responsibility for not only how we see the world, but what we can also do about it.
Thanks very much, Meg. Mirren, round us off here with your thoughts about what we're carrying forward. What are the ways in which the world can be moved here?
So when we talk about, is this working? When we talk about sort of creating a movement, I agree with what Henry mentioned earlier. The first question that we need to answer is, what's this movement really about? And having listened to a lot of conversation, and the second question is, how do we actually launch that movement? Having listened to the conversations over the past 2 days, I think if we were to distill what we're trying to talk about, it's the fact that most of us feel that the way we work today sucks. And that's a problem because it sucks for so many people in so many places, and it's only a minority of people who are winning at this game and a majority are losing. And which is a problem because we spend so much time at work and also so much of our identities are also caught up in that work as well. And the way we organize the workplace is suboptimal, as evidenced by the fact that, according to a research at Stanford, in the US, the workplace is the 5th leading cause of death. And also, which leads to people being disengaged and being disenfranchised at the workplace. So how do we actually change that? And that, for me, is what this movement is all about. I think the way to look at this is to change the way that we look at companies. I think if we look at companies not as these mechanistic entities, but rather as communities, to start looking at them not as organizations, but more as organisms. The way that we look at tribes, for instance, or we look at cities, or we look at countries, which are places where people come together and kind of figure out a way to kind of live together. And that's what a company is as well, which is a community of people. And that's the kind of mindset shift that we require right now. How do we actually build a movement around that? I think a lot of good points have been made already, but for me, there are 3 things that I'd like to emphasize. I think the first one is that we need to bring the victims to the table. If we look at most of the successful movements in history, it's not really the people who were comfortable that managed to create that change. It was the people who were uncomfortable, the ones for whom things weren't quite working. That's been true for the Me Too movement. It's been true for the Black Lives Matter movement. And if you look at the room over here, I think these are the people who have won in the game at the workplace, not the ones who've lost. So how do we bring in the people for whom it's not working? And there are some successful examples of that to bring more transparency to what's going on at the workplace. There's this famous website in India, for example, called I Paid a Bribe, where since corruption is a big problem, there's a big anti-corruption movement. on that website, anyone who's ever had to pay a bribe anywhere goes in, makes a statement about where it happened and how it happened, so that you can get an idea of the magnitude of the problem. I think for me, the second big element of this would be to celebrate the successes as well. We talk about a lot of companies where things haven't quite worked out, but there are lots of companies for whom they think of themselves as not companies that are making products, but the product is the company is the best product that that company is making. So they focus on building a company, and the product is a byproduct of what they do. And there are interesting examples out there. Basecamp is a really good example. I think Drift is a very good example of a company that really mindfully thinks about how they organize themselves. And then finally, the third point over here for me would be just around charismatic leadership. I think every movement, every idea requires a face and a name. And it can't just be sort of this invisible entity, because at the end of the day, movements are about values. They're about what you are rather than what you do. And you need somebody who embodies those values and embodies that way of doing things. And you know, the civil rights movement would be very different without Martin Luther King, for instance. And similarly, on the other side of the spectrum, Make America Great Again would be very different without Donald Trump. So how do you bring that charismatic leadership to this endeavor? And I think if we bring all those elements together, then we can try and build companies that Sunny Giles talked about, where they're more like ant colonies, where nobody's really, it's not hierarchical, nobody's really leading it, but we really sort of kill the bureaucracy and liberate the organization, as I think Gary Hamel mentioned yesterday as well.
Thanks very much, Miriam. Can I just come back perhaps to Henry for a second on this idea of community? There are lots of people here who are going to go back from this to organizations, corporate organizations mainly, and some of them, despite the calls from Steve to find the subversive sleeper cells that are already doing things, are going to be just crushed again by the jobs that suck that Maren has mentioned. So, I mean, how do we prevent this happening? Because year after year we could come to this conference and return more or less to the same rigid straitjacket that has been applied for the last 10 years and more.
Yeah, we return to two kinds of communities, in quotes. We return to where we work, which may or may not have a sense of community. I mean, I'm always running around saying that a healthy organization is a community of human beings. It's not a collection of human resources. The good ones are communities of human beings, and they're the ones we love to work in. And if we're not working in one of those, what do? Frankly, I think a lot of them could be taken off the stock market and to their benefit. I think the stock market has become utterly destructive of the sense of community. You don't make your numbers, so you fire 5,000 people. How come those 5,000 people were redundant 2 weeks ago? You're also returning to your own communities. And we all have our own communities. I don't mean networks of contacts, that's different. I mean personal communities, all kinds of communities. Everybody in this room interacts with probably 5 or 10 plural sector organizations in the last week, whether you worked out at the Y or whatever you did, including the Drucker Forum. So we have, and my feeling is, if your work community is rotten, then use your personal community to drive some kind of change in the world. That's where it's going to have to start. It's going to have to start on the ground. Business will not solve the problem that is largely the making of business, which is the complete tilting of power away from the other sectors. I'm a huge fan of companies that serve me well. I'm a huge fan of them. But I don't want them meddling in my government. You know, if a chief executive says, how can I be more responsible? I say, get out of our government. It's your government, it's my government, but it's not your company's government, and it's not your money's government. The United States Supreme Court legalized bribery, and it's been downhill ever since. So we've got to stop that, and governments are too co-opted to stop that.
Roger, the equation, Tilley's equation that you mentioned, does this work at the scale that we're talking about with the smaller groups, the ability to kind of bring sleeper cells out within or use our own communities? Because this is a very attractive idea of individuals being able to touch other individuals and gradually build up the cellular organization that was mentioned in the first panel.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's easier at the smaller level, and to Meg's point earlier, it kind of all starts. Almost everything starts small, and the question is can you scale it? And so I think having those as the principles, you know, we need We need to slowly but surely grow the numbers. We need to be committed to it. We need to be unified around something, and we need to make sure we maintain our worthiness. If you start small, I think it has a much better chance of going viral from that. So and it's not my equation, somebody else's, but I really like his little formula.
Right, Steve? You're on, I think.
I mean, the suggestion that nothing has changed and that we're just spinning wheels, I think is incorrect. 5 years ago, when the world's experts asked me, well, if you think these ideas are actually going to work, show me some big organizations that are successfully doing it. And I didn't really have a good answer at that time. Now, the situation is radically different. I can point to the 5 largest, fastest growing firms on the planet and say, look at those. And that is persuasive evidence. I think the Drucker Forum itself, 5 years ago, we couldn't even talk about these issues or get them on the agenda. Now, almost every panel has been talking about them, sometimes lip service, but sometimes actually getting into the substance of how you actually make things work. So my sense is that the world has changed and the Drucker Forum has changed, and I think we can build on that foundation and take it further.
Rita, you'd like to build on that, just to give us a resounding tune to sing as we saunter away?
Well, I think we've actually got really strong evidence of movements that are groundswells from the bottom up, and I'll name 3. The 1% movement, the one that really called out and made that part of our vocabulary. The Tea Party movement, which produced some really unexpected consequences, and most recently in the US, the Indivisible movement, which was a real grassroots effort for people that created the agenda that was right for their own community and created very substantial political change to the effect where they actually changed power in control of one of our political houses. And nobody thought that was possible. Nobody thought that was possible. It was tens of thousands of people working at an extraordinarily local level that, made it there. And I'll give just one quote that I thought was really hilarious from a former Republican representative who said he could not get away from these people. They were his own constituents. He could not get away from them. These women, he said, were up in my grill every minute of every day. And he finally decided he'd had enough and stopped. So I just think those are really very clear indications that it doesn't have to be sort of some huge top-down, let's change the Constitution kind of thing. You can create a lot of very substantial change at quite a local level with the right amount of galvanization and with the right tools. And I think what made those movements possible was, the contribution of a number of people who said, this is how you do it, so that people got the confidence to take actions which they otherwise wouldn't have done. So I think there's really strong evidence it can happen.
Thank you, Rita. We're going to have to wind up, so the message is very clear. You have individual responsibility. Don't feel that you're tools of the organizations in which you work. You have the ability to go back as individuals, take responsibility, find other individuals with similar mindsets, and be ready to, as Meg put it, quoting Roosevelt, step into the arena. And if it's not scary, you're probably not doing it right. So please thank our panel, and good luck.
Andrew and panel members, thank you very much for this final contribution. I have only a few words to add. It's words of thanks. I would like to thank again our sponsors. I guess we will see them again. So yeah, here I can move that. I said in the beginning, it's partners, it's strategic partners, and we appreciate this support. I would also like to thank very much our speakers and chairs who gave their time also in preparing for this forum. And I would say they were those who made the magic happen. And I felt there was quite some magic. I would also like to thank the team who brought them in a position to make the magic happen, because there was a lot of work behind that. So anybody from the team who is here, please stand up that you can be seen. Show yourself, raise your hand. And I would also like to thank our conference chair, Tatiana Mahmoud, who did an excellent job. Please, stand up, Tatiana. You will want to go back. You have been here for quite a while, but I will just, to those who still want to spend a few minutes, I extend an invitation. Next door in the ceremonial saal, we will have actually what we call a ceremony, a small ceremony where the Drucker Forum receives something from the Brand Laureate Foundation. So it's not mandatory, right? There's no problem. You may go home, but if you want to stay a few more minutes, join us in the ceremonial saal for a Zeremonie. To stay in the German version of it. That's immediately after this, after we close here. Now, my very last point. I'm always announcing at this point the next year's forum. So here again the sponsors, in case I haven't shown them all. Take another look. And this is the next forum. The power of ecosystems managing in a networked world. We have talked a lot about ecosystems. For Drucker, it was an important notion. He talked about the social ecology of organizations and institutions. So we have a very strong connection to Drucker, and we have a very strong connection to our time and to the complexity of networks we are dealing with at all levels. So the next forum will be again here in the Hofburg, in the Imperial Palace. So I really hope to see many of you back next year. And again, those who want to join us, please join us in the ceremonial saal. Otherwise, I wish you a safe trip back home. Thank you for joining and for staying with us.